whisper in the silence. There are moments in life when everything around us seems to fall into stillness. The world continues to spin, yet something inside us comes to a halt. It might be during a sleepless night, staring at the ceiling, unsure of tomorrow, or in the middle of a crowded street, suddenly feeling alone in a sea of people. It is in these moments, quiet, trembling, and uncertain, that many begin to ask, God, are you there? Ethan Monroe was not a man of faith, not truly. Raised in a modest home in the suburbs of Chicago, he grew up attending church on Sundays, mouthing hymns he didn't understand, and memorizing verses out of routine rather than revelation. Life moved on, and faith became an accessory, not an anchor. By his early 30s, Ethan had built a career in consulting, priding himself on logic, efficiency, and control. God, if he existed, seemed distant, an old myth that didn't belong in corporate boardrooms and quarterly projections. But one evening changed everything. It began with a phone call. His younger sister, Abigail, who had battled leukemia for 2 years, was fading. The doctors had done all they could. Ethan rushed to the hospital, driven more by guilt than love. He hadn't seen Abby in 6 months. When he arrived, the room was dim, filled with the soft hum of machines and the rhythmic beep of a monitor. Abigail, pale and thinner than he remembered, looked up and smiled weakly. "You made it," she whispered, and then, with a clarity that pierced through years of spiritual numbness, she said, "Ethan, God's been talking to me." He froze. "What do you mean?" "I hear him in ways I never did before," she said, in the silence, in the way the nurses speak, even in the pain. "He's guiding me through this." That night, Ethan sat by her side, unable to sleep. The weight of her words wouldn't leave him. God speaks. But how? To whom? And why would he speak to someone like him? Skeptical, flawed, half-believing. In the days that followed, Ethan began to notice things he had never paid attention to before. Coincidences that felt too perfect. Conversations that struck exactly the chord he needed. Dreams that lingered longer than they should have. Was it just his imagination? Or was someone, trying to reach him? This story is not just Ethan's. It is the story of every soul that has ever longed for direction, for meaning, for the divine whisper in the midst of chaos. This is the journey of learning to recognize the voice of God, not through thunder or fire, but through the ordinary, the painful, the beautiful, and the quiet. The air outside the hospital felt heavier than it should have. Ethan Monroe walked slowly, hands in his coat pockets, his thoughts scattered and fragile. Abigail's words from the night before replayed in his mind on a loop. God is speaking to me. Not in the poetic, abstract way people say when they want to sound wise or comforted, but with the quiet, unwavering certainty of someone who had heard something, felt something, knew something. Ethan had stayed in the hospital all night, dozing in a stiff chair next to his sister's bed. She had fallen asleep quickly after saying those words, leaving him alone with the hum of machines and the strange, unfamiliar restlessness growing in his chest. For years, Ethan had kept his world clean and calculated. Schedules, meetings, numbers, results. God didn't fit into that structure. Not really. Faith was messy, unmeasurable, and inconvenient. But now, for the first time in a long time, something outside of him, something he couldn't define, was knocking. He stepped into a small coffee shop across from the hospital, not really expecting anything, just needing to breathe air that didn't smell like antiseptic. The place was nearly empty. A few nurses chatted softly near the window, and in the corner, a man sat with a Bible open in front of him. Ethan took his coffee and sat at a table nearby, lost in thought, turning the paper cup slowly in his hand. "You look like someone who had a long night," a voice said gently. Ethan looked up, surprised to see the man with the Bible smiling at him. "Yeah," he replied, not really wanting to talk. "Someone close to you?" "My sister," Ethan said, after a pause. "Leukemia." The man nodded, his eyes warm, not pitying. Sometimes God uses the nights to prepare us for the dawn. Ethan tilted his head, unsure how to respond. "You probably think he's silent," the man continued, "but sometimes, God doesn't shout, he whispers. We just forget how to listen." Ethan blinked. "You don't know me." "No," the man said calmly, "but he does." And just like that, he stood up, tucked the Bible under his arm, and left. Ethan sat frozen. He didn't believe in signs, or at least, he hadn't. But something about that encounter felt too perfect, too precise. like an answer to a question he hadn't fully formed yet. Back in the car, Ethan turned on the radio. Almost absently, static buzzed before a song began playing, a soft, acoustic melody with a voice that sounded both distant and close. He was about to switch it off when the lyrics caught him by the throat. "When you feel like you're alone in the fight, know I'm the whisper in your silent night." He stared ahead, not really seeing the street. The stranger's words echoed again in his mind. God doesn't shout, he whispers. Was it a coincidence? Or was someone, trying to reach him? He shook the thought away, parking at the hospital and heading back inside. Abigail was asleep again. A nurse smiled at him and said she had had a rough morning but was peaceful now. Ethan sat beside her for a while, watching her chest rise and fall. Then his eyes fell on a small journal lying beside her pillow, leather-bound, with a worn elastic strap holding it closed. Curious, and a little hesitant, he picked it up. The pages were filled with her handwriting, careful and neat, marked by the slow rhythm of reflection. Not a diary full of complaints or details about treatments, but a collection of small, sacred moments. Notes like, "I asked God why the pain hasn't stopped. He didn't answer the way I wanted, but he sent Nurse Lucy, and she held my hand while I cried. That was enough. Saw a rainbow today, second one this month. I think he's reminding me that promises still stand, even if the storm hasn't passed. Ethan doesn't visit, but I'm praying for him. God can reach him, even when I can't." Ethan felt something in his chest twist. He wasn't offended, he wasn't angry, he was ashamed. Abigail had been thinking of him, praying for him, when he had all but disappeared from her life. And yet here she was, leaving a trail of spiritual breadcrumbs, subtle and steady, like someone waiting patiently for someone else to catch up. For the rest of the day, Ethan moved through the hours in a kind of haze. Everything looked the same, but he felt different, like his eyes were adjusting to a light he hadn't known was there. In the bookstore next to the pharmacy, he randomly picked up a book and opened it to a chapter titled, "When God Speaks Through Unlikely Things." On the way back to the hospital, a volunteer chaplain passed him in the hallway and simply said, "God often speaks after we're quiet long enough to hear him." Even in his sleep that night, Ethan couldn't escape it. He dreamt of Abigail, healthy, glowing, walking down a field of tall grass toward a golden horizon. She smiled at him, and just before the dream faded, she turned and whispered, "Listen, Ethan." He woke up gasping, heart pounding, as if those words had been spoken aloud. The room was dark, the silence heavy. He sat there for a long time, not thinking, not analyzing, just listening. For what? He didn't know. Later that evening, he found himself wandering into the hospital's small chapel. It was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of stained glass. He sat in the back pew and closed his eyes. No expectations, no speeches, just an exhausted man asking a question he didn't know how to form. Finally, he whispered, almost to himself, "God, if you're there, speak, I'm listening." And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel empty, it felt alive. The morning after Ethan whispered that fragile prayer in the hospital chapel, he awoke to a soft knock on his hotel room door. He opened it to find a small envelope on the floor. No name, no handwriting, just tucked beneath the edge of the door. Curious, he brought it inside, opened it, and unfolded a single sheet of paper. It was printed with a verse, "Whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you, saying, 'This is the way, walk in it.'" Isaiah chapter 30 verse 21. Ethan sat down, paper in hand, as his heart began to race, not with fear, but with something unfamiliar. Could someone have known he'd been in the chapel last night? Was it a coincidence? Or was this, like everything else lately, another one of those quiet echoes? He took the verse with him and tucked it into his wallet. Something about the words felt planted, not random, but intentional, like it was waiting for him. And so, for the first time in years, he began to actively look, not just passively observe, for God's movement. At the hospital, Abigail was awake, more alert than she had been in days. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, and she reached for his hand without hesitation. "I dreamt of you last night," she said softly. "Yeah?" Ethan asked, sitting beside her. "You were standing in a garden, not lost, just quiet, listening. There were birds, and light, and you weren't afraid." He didn't know what to say. Her words matched the feeling he had been carrying since the chapel. That subtle shift inside him, like the wind had changed direction. like something invisible was aligning. That day, Ethan stepped outside to get some fresh air. He sat on a bench near the edge of the hospital garden, where a young girl was blowing bubbles while her mother talked on the phone. The girl approached him, grinning, and without a word, handed him a single bubble wand. Ethan chuckled and took it, watching as she ran off again. He blew gently, sending a shimmering orb into the air. As it floated upward, the sunlight hit it just right, casting a spectrum of colors. For a brief moment, he felt weightless, like time had slowed, and peace had slipped in unnoticed. He thought of Abigail's journal, of the rainbow she wrote about. He thought of her prayer for him, and of how she said God could reach the unreachable. Maybe, just maybe, that was happening now. Later, in the hospital elevator, he found himself riding alone with an elderly woman holding a well-worn Bible. She looked up at him and said, "Your burden's heavy, isn't it?" He hesitated, unsure how to answer. "God lifts heavy things," she said, patting his arm. "If you let him." The elevator dinged. She stepped off. He never saw her again. That night, he went back to the chapel. He didn't speak this time. He just sat, letting the silence wash over him. There was no voice, no revelation, just a strange certainty, like sitting in a dark room and suddenly knowing someone else is there. Not because you see them, but because you feel the weight of presence. As the days passed, Ethan began to take notes. Not formal ones, just thoughts, fragments, observations. I don't know if God is speaking, but I do know I'm hearing more than I used to. Is it him, or just my own mind? But why does it bring peace if it's only me? He wrote about the stranger in the coffee shop, the song on the radio, the Bible verse under his door, the girl with the bubble wand, the woman in the elevator. It all felt like threads, separate, but pulling him toward something, or someone. One afternoon, he sat with Abigail as she slept, watching the sun cast shifting shadows across her blanket. A nurse came in, new, one Ethan hadn't met. Her name tag read, Grace. She smiled warmly and said, "She's been talking a lot about you. Says you're starting to change." Ethan blinked. "Did she tell you that?" "She did," Grace replied. Said her brother finally opened his heart. Later, Ethan asked Abigail about it. "You didn't say that to the nurse, did you?" She smiled slyly, not with words. He laughed, despite himself. "You're impossible." "No," she said softly. "I'm just finally seeing clearly. And when you see clearly, you stop being afraid of saying what's true." That night, Ethan dreamed again. This time, he was standing in front of an open door. Beyond it was light, not blinding, but warm, like a sunrise. He hesitated, then he heard a voice, familiar, though he couldn't place it, say, "Step forward, I've been waiting." He woke with tears on his face. The next morning, he did something unexpected. He walked into the hospital chapel not just to sit, but to speak. He knelt at the small altar, hands clasped, heart raw. "I don't know the rules," he began. "I don't even know what I believe fully. But if you're speaking, I'm listening, not just for signs or dreams, but with my whole heart. Teach me how to hear." In that moment, no thunder shook the sky, but something broke inside him, a dam of resistance, of cynicism, of logic pretending to be strength. And from its cracks, something new began to grow. The days began to shift in rhythm, not because the hospital grew quieter or because Abigail's condition improved. In fact, it grew worse, but because something inside Ethan had changed. The world hadn't become less painful, only more meaningful. Pain, strangely, now had shape, like a river given form by the banks that held it. And within that river, Ethan was beginning to see reflections he hadn't noticed before. He started reading Abigail's Bible, not in long stretches or grand studies, but piece by piece. Here a psalm, there a parable, words he had heard 100 times in childhood but had never truly read. Now, they seemed to glow on the page. One evening, he landed on Psalm chapter 46 verse 10, "Be still, and know that I am God." He repeated it to himself like a breath. Be still. It felt like an invitation, not just to stop moving, but to surrender trying to control everything. Back in Abigail's room, he shared it with her. "I always loved that verse," she said, her voice weak but content. "People think faith is action, and it is, sometimes, but most days, it's just sitting still and trusting the floor won't give out." Ethan smiled. "I don't know if I'm there yet." "You're closer than you think." Later that night, Ethan found himself standing outside in the hospital garden again. Just before midnight, the moon was full, casting a silvery glow across the empty benches and flower beds. The scent of jasmine drifted lightly through the air. He stood there, hands in his pockets, looking up at the sky that seemed too wide to hold all his questions. A gentle breeze brushed past him, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, and again, there it was, not a voice in the wind, not a message spelled out in the stars, but a peace that settled in the silence. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was simply presence. The kind you don't need to see to believe, like warmth from a fire you haven't reached yet. The following day, Abigail asked him something unexpected. "Will you pray with me?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know how." "You don't have to know how. Just be honest." So they prayed, slowly, simply, awkwardly. He held her hand, and for the first time, spoke not at God, but to him. "Thank you," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "for letting her still be here. For these moments." Abigail smiled through tired eyes. "See, that's it." In the hallway afterward, he ran into Grace again, the nurse whose presence had begun to feel almost angelic. She looked at him and said, "You're different." "Trying to be," he replied. "No, not trying, becoming." He didn't respond, but the words stayed with him. Later that week, Ethan was walking through the hospital when he passed a bulletin board filled with handwritten notes. He'd never stopped to look before. Now something pulled him toward it. There, pinned in the corner, was a note in familiar handwriting. "Even when I am weak, he is strong. Even when I'm afraid, he is near." He recognized the slant of the letters, Abigail's. She had written it weeks ago. He stood staring at the paper, unable to move. It wasn't just a note. It was a message, a piece of her faith left as a footprint. And now, he was following. On the drive home that night, Ethan turned off the radio. He rolled down the window, letting the cold air sting his skin and clear his mind. His phone buzzed, a message from his assistant about a project deadline he had forgotten. For the first time, he didn't panic. He replied calmly, deferring the task. Something had shifted. He no longer felt like he was losing control, but like he was finally letting go of the illusion that he ever had it. The next morning, Abigail was asleep when he arrived, but her breathing was shallow. A nurse gently placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Today may be hard." He sat by her bed, journal in his lap, Bible beside it. He whispered scripture to her, Psalm chapter 23, one she had marked with underlines and tiny stars. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Her fingers twitched faintly. He held her hand. For hours, he didn't speak. He didn't beg for a miracle. He just sat with her, trusted the silence, trusted the presence that now felt so near he could almost hear it breathe. And in that stillness, he felt it again, that peace that made no sense. A peace that didn't erase the pain, but wrapped around it like light around a wound. A peace that whispered, "I am here." Ethan had always believed that real change came through effort, strategy, timing, control. But in those quiet days beside Abigail's hospital bed, he learned that the deepest transformations often happen in surrender, not in doing more, but in simply being present, with the pain, with the questions, and with the unseen presence that now seemed to accompany him everywhere. Abigail's condition was worsening. The doctors no longer spoke in hopeful percentages. Their language shifted to comfort, to time, to letting go. But Abigail herself seemed more at peace than ever. Her voice was weaker, her skin pale, but her eyes, they sparkled, like they held a secret no one else could see. "I think I'm almost home," she whispered one afternoon, as Ethan read to her from the book of John. "Don't talk like that," he said gently, but there was no fear in his voice anymore. Just sadness, and strangely, reverence. "Home isn't here," she smiled faintly. "It never was." He took her hand, nodding slowly. He didn't have the strength to argue anymore. Not because he had given up, but because he had begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was right. That evening, he stayed longer than usual. The nurses dimmed the lights. Machines hummed softly. He sat in silence for a long time before opening Abigail's journal once again. This time, he flipped to the very first page. There, in her looping handwriting, was a prayer. "God, if this suffering is the path you've chosen for me, let it not be wasted. Let it wake something in Ethan. Let it lead him home." He didn't cry right away. The tears came slowly, one at a time, like raindrops falling from a branch. But inside, something broke open. Not a shattering, but a blooming, the kind of breaking that makes space for something new. That night, back at his hotel, he did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He knelt beside the bed. No one told him to. No dramatic moment pushed him there. Just a quiet pull, like gravity with intention. God, he said softly, I don't have the right words. I don't even know where this leads. But I believe you're here. I believe you've been speaking. Through her. Through the silence. Through everything. I'm ready to follow. The stillness that followed felt sacred. Not empty, not hollow, sacred. In the following days, Ethan began to change in ways even he didn't expect. He didn't just visit Abigail. He sat with other patients too, reading, listening, sometimes just holding a hand. He started to greet the nurses by name. He brought coffee to the janitor, who worked alone through the night shift. These weren't grand gestures, they were small seeds, planted in the ordinary, but something inside him had learned that this loving, quiet awareness, was part of how God spoke. One afternoon, as he sat near the hospital chapel reading, an older man walked in, looking disoriented. He muttered something about his wife being in surgery and that he couldn't breathe. Ethan stood and guided him to a seat. Can I sit with you? He asked. The man nodded, eyes full of panic. Ethan didn't offer platitudes. He didn't pretend to understand. He just placed a hand on the man's shoulder and whispered, You're not alone. For a moment, they sat in silence. Then the man said, You're a pastor or something? Ethan almost laughed. No, he said, just someone who started listening. After the man left, Ethan stayed in the chapel a while longer. The stained glass window threw colored light across the pews. He thought about how many people had walked through that room in grief, in desperation, in search of hope. He thought about how many of them, like him, weren't looking for a voice from heaven, but for something steady to hold on to. He reached into his wallet and pulled out the verse someone had slipped under his hotel door days before. Isaiah chapter 30 verse 21. This is the way, walk in it. It no longer felt like a distant promise. It felt like a direction, a confirmation. Later that night, Abigail was awake and waiting. You look lighter, she whispered. I think, I'm starting to believe, he said. In what? That this story is bigger than me. That maybe your prayers weren't just hopeful words. They never were, she smiled. I knew you'd find your way. No, he said softly, taking her hand. I think God found me. She nodded, eyes filled with tears. He always does. Outside the window, the stars were beginning to bloom in the night sky. Ethan looked at them and thought of Abraham, of David, of people who had wandered and wrestled and still been called beloved. He realized faith didn't begin with certainty. It began with a response, a simple, quiet yes. And for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't afraid of the unknown. He wasn't paralyzed by what couldn't be measured. Because he had felt something stronger than evidence, he had felt the presence of love. Unshakable and real, he leaned in, kissed Abigail's forehead, and whispered, Thank you. For what? She said, eyes half closed. For showing me how to listen. The morning Abigail passed away was unusually still. The wind had stopped. The clouds hung in the sky like they were waiting. Even the usual hum of the hospital felt quieter, as if the building itself knew something sacred was happening. Ethan had fallen asleep beside her bed, her frail fingers still wrapped loosely around his. He awoke to the softest squeeze, a final gesture, and when he opened his eyes, Abigail was looking at him, not afraid, not in pain, just present. Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He's here, I know, he said, voice cracking. I'm ready. He didn't beg her to stay. He didn't cry out for more time. He simply held her hand tighter and said, You're going home. She smiled, the smallest curve of her lips. Then her eyes closed gently, like falling into sleep. A breath, then stillness. Ethan sat there long after the monitor had stopped. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just let the silence surround him. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel like loss. It felt like reverence. The nurse who came in later didn't say anything. She just placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and whispered. She had such peace. She gave it to me, Ethan replied, eyes still fixed on his sister's face. That evening, after the calls had been made and arrangements set in motion, Ethan found himself walking, without destination, through the city. The noise of traffic, the blur of people, the neon lights, it all seemed distant, like a world he had left behind. He stopped at a small church on the corner of a quiet street. It wasn't open, but he sat on its front steps, breathing in the night air. He remembered the verse in Abigail's journal, "Let it not be wasted. Let it wake something in Ethan." And now, sitting alone on that step, he whispered through tears, "It wasn't wasted, Abby, I'm awake now." The following days moved in waves: grief, memory, peace, then grief again. But through it all, Ethan no longer felt alone. Every time he opened her Bible, he found notes in the margins, little messages, thoughts, arrows pointing toward verses that now seemed written directly for him. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. Psalm chapter 34 verse 18. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Hebrews chapter 13 verse 5. One night, he found a letter tucked into the back of her journal. It was addressed to him. Dear Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm probably not there anymore. Or maybe I am, in 1,000 ways you won't expect. I want you to know something. I never doubted that God would reach you. I didn't know how, or when, but I knew, because love never stops knocking. And God is love. I'm not afraid. I never was, not really. Because I knew my pain wasn't the end of the story. And yours won't be either. Keep listening, keep asking, keep walking. He'll keep guiding, always. With all my love, Abby. Ethan held the letter to his chest and wept, not from despair, but from something deeper, a grief laced with gratitude, a sorrow touched by grace. In the weeks that followed, Ethan returned to work, but not as the same man. His team noticed the change immediately. He listened more, spoke more gently, and seemed anchored. When someone on his team lost their father, Ethan was the first to sit quietly beside them, offering no cliches, just presence. He started writing, not for the public, not yet, just reflections. His own journal began to feel like Abigail's had, prayers, verses, thoughts, sometimes questions with no answers. But that no longer scared him. He also started visiting churches, different ones, not in search of performance or flash, but for stillness, for community, for that same presence he had come to know in silence. And in one small church on a rainy Sunday morning, as the congregation sang softly and the pastor spoke on hearing God through brokenness, Ethan felt something rise within him. Not emotion, not memory, but conviction. Maybe his journey wasn't just about him. Maybe it was meant to echo. That week, he met with the hospital chaplain. They spoke for hours. Ethan shared everything. From the first moment Abigail said, "God is speaking to me," to the last breath she took. The chaplain listened, eyes glistening, then said, "You have a story that needs to be told." "I'm not a preacher," Ethan said quietly. "No," the chaplain smiled. "But you're a witness." That night, Ethan made a decision. He began outlining a series, videos, writings, conversations, not about theology or doctrine, but about how God speaks, not with thunder or spectacle, but with whispers, people, dreams, silence, just as he had spoken to him. He titled it, God Speaks, 20 Ways to Recognize His Guidance in Your Life. Not to teach, but to invite, not to answer every question, but to help others start listening. And so, a man who once believed only in what could be measured now stood on the edge of something eternal, not as a skeptic, not even as a teacher, but as someone who had learned to hear. And more than that, someone who had finally begun to follow. 6 months after Abigail's passing, Ethan stood on a small stage in a community center, not far from the hospital where she had taken her last breath. The room was filled with folding chairs, mismatched mugs of coffee, and a crowd of people, some curious, some grieving, some simply searching. He hadn't planned on speaking to anyone. But something changed when he began filming the series, God Speaks, 20 Ways to Recognize His Guidance in Your Life. What started as private reflections soon turned into a shared journey. The first video, God Speaks Through Silence, had unexpectedly gone viral. Comments poured in from strangers. I thought I was alone. This gave me hope. I heard him too, in the middle of my storm. Ethan never tried to sound like an expert. He just told the truth, raw, unpolished, human, and the world, tired of answers and hungry for authenticity, leaned in. Now, standing before the quiet crowd, Ethan looked down at the small leather journal he held, Abigail's. Its edges were worn, its pages filled with her prayers, dreams, and unwavering faith. He opened it and began. I used to think God was silent, he said, voice steady but soft, or that he only spoke to certain people with clean lives, or perfect faith. People who knew how to pray the right way. Some in the crowd nodded. But then I met someone who believed otherwise, my sister. And through her journey, I discovered something I never expected, that God is always speaking. We just forget how to listen. He paused, letting the stillness settle in. He speaks through people, through pain, through memories, through verses scribbled in the margins of an old Bible, through quiet rooms and long walks, through children handing you a bubble wand, through strangers in elevators, through the last breath of someone you love. His voice caught, just briefly. He took a breath, and sometimes, he speaks not to fix our brokenness, but to sit with us inside of it, to let us know we're not walking alone. He looked out into the faces, young, old, weary, hopeful. Maybe that's why you're here today. Not for theology, but for presence. To remember that this world is loud, but God often whispers. Someone in the back wiped away tears. After the talk, people lined up not to ask questions, but just to say thank you. Some simply hugged him. A young woman handed him a drawing of a garden, and a man standing in it, still and peaceful, with light breaking through the trees. At the bottom she had written, "You helped me find the voice I stopped listening for." Ethan placed it in the back of Abigail's journal. That night, he walked home under a sky filled with stars. They weren't signs, they didn't spell anything, but somehow, they still spoke, about wonder, about mystery, about the God who created them, and also cared enough to speak to the hearts of people who didn't think they were worthy. He thought about his old life, the noise, the pressure, the constant drive to build something measurable. Now, his days were quieter, but richer. His time was filled with simple things, helping at a local shelter, mentoring teens, visiting hospital patients who didn't have family. And he still wrote, still filmed, still listened. One morning, while sipping coffee and watching the sunrise from his porch, he received a letter. It was from a young man in Brazil who had watched his video series. "I was going to take my life," the letter began, "but something in your voice stopped me. Not because you said the right thing, but because it felt like you were speaking from a place I recognized, pain and peace at the same time. I don't know if I believe in God yet, but I believe He believes in me. Thank you for reminding me I still matter." Ethan read it twice. Then he looked up at the morning sky and whispered, "Thank you, because this was what Abigail had prayed for. Not a career shift, not a platform, but a heart turned homeward. A brother who could finally hear." He smiled, thinking of her. She wasn't gone, not really. She was in every word he wrote, every person he comforted, every tear he wiped from a stranger's face. She was part of the garden now, growing inside him. Weeks later, he returned to the hospital chapel. It looked the same, empty pews, soft light through stained glass. He sat in the same spot he had that first night, the night he whispered. "Are you speaking? Now," he whispered again. "I hear you." He pulled out a pen and wrote a note on a small card he carried with him. Then he slipped it under the seat cushion before he left. A message for the next weary soul who would stumble in. Searching. The card read, "You're not lost. God is speaking, even now. Don't be afraid to listen."